Hey guys, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. My name is Crown, and today I'm going to read you some very interesting stories that I hope that you're gonna love. And now, without further ado, let's go!
I'm in my early 20s, petite, blonde, and apparently look like I don't know the difference between a carburetor and a catalytic converter. This happened a few years back when I was looking for my first proper car. I had saved up enough money from working at the local grocery store and wanted something reliable to get me to college classes and back. One day, I was driving past a local motorcycle dealership and noticed they had a small hatchback sitting out front with a for sale sign. I pulled in, curious about why a motorcycle place was selling a car. The salesman approached me with a wide smile as soon as I stepped out of my old beater. He greeted me enthusiastically and asked if I was interested in the car, calling it a little beauty. I replied that I was interested and asked why a motorcycle dealership was selling a car. The salesman explained that it had been their shop runabout. He mentioned they actually had two of them and didn't need both anymore, saying it was just taking up space in the lot. He was friendly enough, and the price was surprisingly good for a car that looked decent from the outside. Clean interior, decent tires, and the body was in good shape. The salesman commented that it was a great little car for someone like me, perfect for getting around town. I noticed a slight condescension in his tone. Someone like you, but I let it slide. I asked him how the engine was running. He assured me it was running pretty good for its age. He mentioned it used a little oil but claimed that was normal for older cars and nothing to worry about. I requested to take it for a test drive. He readily agreed and went to grab the keys. The test drive went fine. Nothing seemed immediately wrong, though I didn't have much time to really put it through its paces. When I got back, the salesman was already holding paperwork. He asked what I thought, suggesting it was a great deal for a reliable car. I should have asked more questions. I should have insisted on having it inspected, but the price was right, and I needed the car fast since my old one was on its last legs. I told him I would take it. The paperwork was quick, and before I knew it, I was driving home in my new used car. The salesman seemed almost too eager to get me out of there, but I chalked it up to having other customers to help. The engine was on the verge of blowing. They had probably used thicker oil and additives to mask major internal problems during the short test drive. Classic shady dealership move, but they didn't expect their dumb, blonde customer to figure it out. After doing some research on consumer protection laws, I found out I had rights. Since I'd owned the car less than 4 weeks, they were legally required to fix major mechanical issues that existed at the time of sale. I drove back to the dealership, put on my best confused young woman act, and walked in. The same salesman recognized me immediately, and his smile faltered slightly. He greeted me and asked how the car was treating me. I twirled my hair around my finger and gave him my best innocent look. I told him I was a bit confused because the car seemed to be using more oil than he had mentioned. The salesman insisted that, like he had said before, older cars use oil and that was normal. I responded that I understood that, but explained that according to vehicle safety regulations, a car shouldn't use more than 1 quart of oil per 1,000 miles to be sold as roadworthy. I pointed out that this one was using about 1 quart every 100 miles. His face dropped. The manager, who must have been listening, came over. The manager asked what the problem was. I explained that we were discussing how the car they sold me was using oil way beyond the legal parameters for a roadworthy vehicle. I added that since I'd spotted this within 4 weeks of purchase, they were liable for its replacement according to consumer protection law. The salesman protested that they had told me it used oil. I clarified that they said a little oil, not catastrophically close to engine failure levels of oil, and that there was a difference. The manager tried to argue that they couldn't just replace an engine. I countered that actually they could and would, unless they preferred eye contact, the Consumer Protection Agency. I mentioned I had their number ready. The salesman and manager exchanged looks. They knew they'd been caught. The manager suggested we talk in his office. In the office, they tried everything to wriggle out of their responsibility. They offered partial payment, suggested I misunderstood the condition, even implied I might have caused the problem myself. I told them directly that we both knew what happened. I explained that they saw a young woman walk in and thought they could offload a problem car. I pointed out that they didn't expect me to know engines better than their mechanics did. 2 weeks later, I drove away with essentially a new car. The engine purred like a kitten, and I could feel the difference in power and smoothness immediately. That was 4 years ago. That replacement engine is still running perfectly. Not a drop of oil being used outside of regular changes. Turns out this dumb blonde got the last laugh after all. My grandmother was the kindest person I knew. She practically raised me after my parents divorced, and my mom had to work 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. When I got married and had kids, she insisted we move into her large farmhouse since there was too much space for an old lady. She loved seeing her great-grandchildren running around the property that had been in our family for generations. When she passed away, I was devastated. The funeral was hard enough, but then came the reading of the will. My grandmother had left the farmhouse and the 5 acres of land to me and my family. She knew we needed it most, and she wanted my children to grow up in a stable home surrounded by nature, just like she'd always wanted for me. Most of the family understood her decision except for my aunt, my father's sister. She'd always felt entitled to my grandmother's property, even though she rarely visited and lived comfortably in a city penthouse 3 hours away. She claimed that as the oldest child, she deserved to inherit the main family property. The day everything went sideways started like any other. My wife and I were in the kitchen making breakfast for our 2 young children, ages 4 and 6. They were still in their pajamas, excited about going to pick strawberries from the garden my grandmother had planted years ago. That's when we heard the aggressive honking of a car horn followed by tires screeching on our gravel driveway. Through the kitchen window, I saw my aunt's luxury SUV come to an abrupt stop. She got out, slamming the door behind her. I sighed and told my wife I'd handle it. I asked her to keep the kids inside, having a bad feeling about this visit. My aunt had been sending increasingly hostile messages since the will reading 3 weeks earlier. I stepped onto the porch just as she walked up the steps. My aunt immediately demanded that we pack our things and leave what she called her house. I reminded her that my grandmother had legally left the property to us in her will and that we'd already been through this discussion. She angrily responded that my grandmother wasn't thinking clearly and had been manipulated by me and my wife. She insisted that everyone knew the property should go to her since she was a sister of my grandmother's firstborn child. I tried to explain to her that inheritance doesn't work that way and mentioned that the lawyer had explained everything clearly at the reading. I expressed sympathy for her upset feelings but stated that this was our home now. That's when she reached into her purse and pulled out a handgun. My blood ran cold as she pointed it directly at my chest. With the gun aimed at me, my aunt stopped asking and started threatening. She declared the property was hers now and ordered us to get our things and leave, or she would remove us herself. I raised my hand slowly, trying to stay calm despite my racing heart. I pleaded with her to put the gun down and think about what she was doing. I mentioned that my children were inside, hoping to appeal to some sense of decency. She heartlessly responded that she didn't care about those brats who shouldn't even be there. She kept insisting it was her house and her land. She gave us 1 hour to get out and threatened to shoot without hesitation if she saw any of us setting foot on what she called her property again. She even mentioned already speaking to a contractor about renovations once we were gone. What my aunt didn't realize was that my wife had been watching this confrontation through the window. After calling emergency services, she had retrieved her legally owned firearm from our locked safe. When my aunt started waving her gun toward the house where our children were, my wife stepped onto the porch. Everything happened so fast. My aunt turned the gun toward my wife, shouting something about trespassers. That's when my wife fired a single shot that hit my aunt in the spine. She collapsed immediately. The police and ambulance arrived within minutes. My aunt survived but suffered a spinal cord injury that left her paralyzed from the waist down. She'll be in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. The investigation was thorough. Security cameras we'd installed after receiving threatening messages from my aunt captured the entire incident. The district attorney ruled it as clear self-defense. My wife had acted to protect our family from an armed threat. My aunt was charged with attempted armed home invasion, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and making terroristic threats. She took a plea deal to avoid a longer prison sentence, but she'll still serve 5 years. My wife has struggled with guilt despite knowing she did what was necessary to protect our children. We've all been in therapy since the incident. The property remains ours, just as my grandmother intended. We've planted a memorial garden for her where we teach our children about her kindness and wisdom. They're too young to fully understand what happened that day, but someday we'll have to explain why their great aunt isn't in our lives anymore. The house feels different now, tainted by violence, in a way my grandmother would have hated, but we're working to reclaim it as the peaceful home she wanted for us. Some family members still believe my aunt was wronged, but most have seen the video evidence and understand she gave my wife no choice. As for my aunt, I hear she's doing physical therapy in prison. I don't wish her ill, but I can't forgive her for pointing a gun at my children. Some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. When my husband and I got married 5 years ago, I knew his sister had issues, but I had no idea how deep they ran or how they would eventually impact our lives. My sister-in-law suffers from borderline personality disorder and has strong narcissistic tendencies. She's been a single mom to her daughter for most of the child's life, though technically she shares custody with her ex. They had a brief relationship that ended shortly after she got pregnant, and while he's tried to be involved, she's made it increasingly difficult over the years. My husband and I don't have kids of our own yet, but we adore our niece. She's 7 now, bright, creative, and surprisingly well-adjusted considering her home situation. We have her over for weekends sometimes to give her a break from the chaos at home, and those visits are always highlights for us. Last month, everything changed when my sister-in-law called my husband out of the blue. She asked him for a huge favor, explaining that she was going through a lot and needed to focus on herself. She asked if we could take care of her daughter for a while. My husband put her on speaker so I could hear too. When he asked what she meant by a while, she explained that it would just be until she got things sorted out. She claimed she was working on her mental health and found it really hard to do that while being a full-time mom. I could immediately tell there was more to the story. My husband looked at me and I nodded slightly. We'd always said we'd be there for our niece if she needed us. When my husband mentioned that we could help out but asked about her father and whether he knew about this arrangement, there was an uncomfortable silence on the other end of the line. She finally responded by saying he didn't need to know. My stomach dropped. I caught my husband's eye and I could tell he was just as disturbed as I was. My husband expressed his shock, asking if she'd been purposely keeping them apart and telling her that wasn't right since he was her father. She got defensive, insisting he was a terrible influence and that this wasn't about him anyway. She said this was about her needing support from her family. I decided to speak up. I told her we were happy to help with our niece because we love her and want what's best for her. But I made it clear we couldn't be part of keeping her away from her father. I explained that he had legal rights, and more importantly, her daughter had a right to know her dad. She responded angrily, asking if we weren't going to help her after everything she'd been through. My husband clarified that we didn't refuse to help. We just said her father needed to be consulted about any long-term arrangement. She accused us of taking his side and said this was why she didn't want to ask us in the first place. The conversation was getting heated, but something wasn't adding up. I decided to probe a little more. I asked how long she was thinking her daughter would stay with us. She hesitated before admitting it might be a few months, 6 at most. I expressed my surprise, pointing out that 6 months wasn't just helping out but a major life change for her daughter. I asked what exactly she was planning to do during this time. She hesitated again, and I knew we were getting to the truth. She reluctantly admitted that she was seeing someone who was amazing, mature, and had his life together, unlike her daughter's father ever did. But this new man wasn't really a kid person, and she needed time to strengthen their relationship without distractions. She wanted to abandon her daughter for half a year to chase a boyfriend who didn't even like children. I called her out, asking if she really wanted to give up her daughter for 6 months for a man who didn't even want her around. I questioned what would happen after the 6 months if he still didn't want kids in his life. She got defensive, accusing me of twisting her words and insisting she wasn't giving her daughter up. She claimed she was just prioritizing her happiness for once and asked if she didn't deserve that. My husband tried to be diplomatic, saying, of course, she deserved happiness, but not at the expense of her daughter's well-being and relationship with her father. At that point, she issued an ultimatum. She said if we wouldn't help her without involving him, she'd find someone who would. She claimed to have friends who understood what she was going through. Then she threatened that we shouldn't expect to see our niece again because she was done with both of us. She hung up, leaving us in stunned silence. My husband was devastated. He and his sister had always been close despite her issues, and now she was threatening to cut us off from our niece, whom we loved dearly. 2 days later, my phone pinged with a text from my husband. He said his sister wanted our Netflix password because she wanted to watch Parenthood. He asked if I could send it to him. I nearly choked on my coffee. After threatening to keep our niece from us forever because we wouldn't help her hide the child from her father, she had the audacity to ask for our Netflix password to watch a movie called Parenthood of all things. I took a deep breath and texted back that I had just changed it to FU. My husband texted back asking if I was serious. I confirmed I was dead serious and told him that if she asked, he should tell her the rest of the password was her name. My husband didn't respond for a few minutes, then texted that he had told her the password and she was furious. I reminded him that we had his number from that time he picked her up from our place. My husband replied that he had just told her that and she was even more furious, but he thought she knew we were serious. A week later, we got a call from the ex. My sister-in-law had suddenly become very accommodating with visitation. Apparently, she'd realized that her plan might backfire if we got involved. She is still angry with us, but our niece came over last weekend, and everything seems back to normal with her. As for the Netflix password, I've changed it again to something more appropriate, but every time I see my sister-in-law looking down at her phone during family gatherings, I smile, wondering if she's still trying FU as the password. And now we have reached the end of today's stories. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.